All right. Well, like Pastor Greg said, I am Rachel Magana, and I served on staff here for a number of years, and I'm really excited to be back today. And I feel like I always tell this little joke, like all the time. But, it's really good to see all of you. And I always think, because whenever people would say that to my dad, he would always say, well, it's good to be seen. And that's how I always feel at Cornerstone, is just that it's good to be seen. And I feel like this is a place where people's voices really matter, and they're given an opportunity to share. And so today, as I'm sharing with you, I'm just coming humbly as myself and just sharing what I feel like God put on my heart to share. And so right now, we are continuing in our sermon series on healing, which has been really, really, really great. And I have the opportunity to share from a passage in Mark that has the story of two healings. And so before we read, I just want to give you a little bit of background to kind of set the stage for what we're going to be reading. So these two healings involve a man named Jairus, who was a synagogue leader and a Jewish official. And so when we think about that, kind of keep in mind that this is a man who was a part of Jewish leadership. And for them, Jesus was a threat. And so just kind of keep that in your mind as we're reading this. And then the other healing that takes place is with a woman, and we don't know her name. All we know is that she is a bleeding woman. And so what that means for her to be a bleeding woman at this time in this culture, based on Jewish law, is that would make her ritually unclean. And so if you're ritually unclean, what that means is that you essentially live on the outskirts of society, because your uncleanness was seen as something that could contaminate anyone that you touched. So keep that in mind as we're reading this story. I'm going to read the passage, and then after that, we'll just go from there. This is from Mark 5, verses 21 through 42. It says, after Jesus returned from across the lake, a huge crowd of people quickly gathered around him on the shoreline. Just then, a man saw that it was Jesus, so he pushed through the crowd and threw himself down at his feet. His name was Jairus, a Jewish official who was in charge of the synagogue. He pled with Jesus, saying over and over, please come with me. My little daughter is at the point of death, and she is only 12 years old. Come and lay your hands on her and heal her, and she will live. Immediately, Jesus went with him, and the huge crowd followed, pressing in on him from all sides. Now in the crowd that day was a woman who had suffered horribly from continual bleeding for 12 years. She had endured a great deal under the care of various doctors, yet in spite of spending all she had on their treatments, she was getting worse instead of better. When she heard about Jesus' healing power, she pushed through the crowd and came up from behind him and touched his prayer shawl, for she kept saying to herself, if I could touch even his clothes, I know I will be healed. As soon as her hand touched him, her bleeding immediately stopped. She knew it, for she could feel her body instantly healed of her disease. And Jesus knew at once that someone had touched him, for he felt the power that had always surged around him had passed through him for someone to be healed. He turned and spoke to the crowd, saying, who touched my clothes? His disciples answered, what do you mean, who touched you? Look at this huge crowd. They're all pressing up against you. But Jesus' eyes swept across the crowd, looking for the one who had touched him for healing. When the woman who experienced this miracle realized what had happened to her, she came before him, trembling with fear, and threw herself down at his feet, saying, I was the one who touched you. And she told him her story of what had just happened. Then Jesus said to her, daughter, because you dared to believe, your faith has healed you. Go with peace in your heart and be free from your suffering. And before he had finished speaking, people arrived from Jairus' house and pushed through the crowd to give Jairus the news. "There is no need to trouble the master any longer. Your daughter has died." But Jesus refused to listen to what they were told and said to the Jewish official, "Don't yield to fear. All you need to do is to keep on believing." So they left for his home. But Jesus didn't allow anyone to go with him except Peter and the two brothers, Jacob and John. When they arrived at the home of the synagogue ruler, they encountered a noisy uproar among the people, for they were all weeping and wailing. Upon entering the home, Jesus said to them, "Why all this grief and weeping? Don't you know the girl is not dead, but merely asleep?" Then everyone began to ridicule and make fun of him. But he threw them all outside. Then he took the child's father, mother, and his 3 disciples and went into the room where the girl was lying. He tenderly clasped the child's hand in his and said to her in Aramaic, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, wake up from the sleep of death." Instantly, the 12-year-old girl sat up, stood to her feet, and started walking around the room. Everyone was overcome with astonishment in seeing this miracle. All right. So, as I was reading this, there's just one particular section of these scriptures that really, really stands out to me the most, and it has to do with touch. It's from verses 27 through 34, which is when the woman who had been bleeding, I feel like I need to come up with like a fake name for her so I can stop calling her just the bleeding woman. I don't know. Any ideas? Betsy? Okay, that's it. Betsy. I like it. So we're talking about Betsy, the bleeding woman. But when she heard about Jesus' healing power, she pushed through the crowd. She came up and she touched his shawl. And she said, "If I can just touch him, then I know that I'll be healed." And we see that Jesus felt the power leave his body and asked, "Who touched me?" And then later said, "Because you dared to believe, your faith has healed you." And I, of course, have to point out the disciples because I love their very concrete logic. At this moment, they're saying, we're in a large crowd. There's lots of people touching you. But something was different about this woman's touch. She had been saying to herself, "If I touch him, I'll be healed." And then later, Jesus says, "Because you dared to believe." Let's actually look at that closely. He said, "Daughter, because you dared to believe, your faith has healed you. Go with peace in your heart and be free from your suffering." So my question is, did the touch heal her or the faith? And I'd like to pause here to talk about the kind of faith that Jesus is referring to in this passage. The kind of faith that he's talking about, the noun is piste, but the verb form of faith is pistuo, which means it goes beyond more intellectual agreement and a mental assent to a truth. It involves trust and active reliance on something or someone, which implies accompanying actions or behavior. So it's not simply knowing Jesus has power or Jesus can do this. It's believing and trusting that Jesus is willing and able, and then taking an action. It reminds me of James 2:17 that says, "Faith by itself is not accompanied by action is dead." This shows the understanding that faith is expected to produce works or actions. And for this woman, touching Jesus was her faith in action. She believed that Jesus cared, she believed that Jesus could heal her, and she believed that he was willing and able. And this is what's really, really cool. We've talked about how she was ritually unclean, an outcast of society. She believed that Jesus was bigger than the religious laws of the day. And rather than believing that she could contaminate Jesus, she believed that Jesus would purify her. So if that was her act of faith, then what was Jairus's? Well, let's think about Jairus. What do we know about him? He's an official in the synagogue. He's a Jewish leader. Jesus is an outcast. And in this moment, in a very, very public display in front of huge crowds, he essentially takes a very public stand saying that he believes in Jesus. This is, if you can imagine it, it would be similar to if someone were, let's say, on the board of a fossil fuel company, and then they went on the news saying that they supported clean energy and that they were going to be working to limit fossil fuel emissions, and then going to work the next day. Think about the implications of that, what that would be like. And also, if we look at this passage, we can see that his friends come to him. And I have to say, when I was reading this, I kept thinking, man, these are not very good friends. I mean, his daughter is dying. He's come to Jesus, and he's saying, please, please, please help her. Please heal her. And then his friends come along and say, hey, she's dead. Stop bothering this guy. I mean, how would you feel in that moment? I can tell you right now, I think I would just be so devastated and crushed and sad, and I would be having all of the feelings. But also in this moment, when he's possibly feeling all of these things, Jesus says to him, don't stop believing. Who has ever felt like circumstances in their life have gotten in the way of believing? Guilty. I also wonder if maybe for them they were thinking, oh my gosh, Jairus, you just lost your daughter, and now you've taken this kind of public stand for Jesus. Come on, you're going to lose everything. Just stop, quit while you're ahead, and then maybe you can at least go back to the synagogue tomorrow and say, I had a grief lapse, and I just, maybe they could excuse it away. And Jesus is saying, no, don't stop believing. So his act of faith was going with Jesus back to his home and continuing to walk with Jesus and to continue to have faith that Jesus would heal his daughter. So now I'm going to ask you some questions. I've touched on both of their acts of faith, and what I wonder is if we can think about, and this is not rhetorical, so just think about it, what they had in common with their faith, what their acts of faith had in common. Trust. Yeah, and that's a big part of faith, trusting and believing. They believed in Jesus' power to heal, and they had confidence in Jesus' healing ability. Anybody else? I'm sorry, could you say that again? Yep. They were ready and willing to count the cost, and they had acknowledged that for them, they knew Jesus was it. That they believed that Jesus was the only way. Anybody else? Yeah. They saw Jesus. And in a way, it feels like essentially all of religion and everything else was just sort of faded to the background, and they just saw Jesus, which is really, really cool. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, I have some notes, and I'm just going to kind of move through them. So what I have is, first of all, they believed in Jesus' power to heal. In fact, there was confidence in Jesus' healing ability. Both Jairus and the woman believed that Jesus had the unique ability to heal when all other options had failed. The woman had suffered for 12 years and had seen many doctors, but none could help her. Jairus, despite his status as a synagogue leader, came to Jesus as a last resort, because his daughter was dying. They both believed that Jesus had the power to heal in ways that others, including doctors and religious leaders, could not. They also believed in Jesus' compassion and willingness to help. Both Jairus and the woman trusted that Jesus would care enough to respond to their needs. Jairus, as a synagogue leader, was taking a risk in coming to Jesus, a controversial figure in the religious community, but he trusted that Jesus would help. And similarly, the woman, Betsy, believed that even though she was ritually unclean and should have been socially ostracized, that Jesus would not reject her. They believed in Jesus' authority over sickness and death. Jairus believed that he could heal his dying daughter, and later, when the news came that she had died, Jesus asked him to continue believing. Jairus then had to trust that Jesus had authority over even death itself. And for the woman, believing that her long-standing condition could be healed by Jesus, even though medical solutions had failed her. Many of their contemporaries likely did not have this same level of faith. In fact, when Jesus announced that Jairus' daughter was not dead but asleep, the people laughed at him. This indicates that others were quick to dismiss Jesus' power over death. Another note that I have is that they believed, despite cultural norms and despite barriers. They believed despite barriers and cultural norms. Both Jairus and the woman had to overcome significant social and cultural obstacles to reach out to Jesus. And we can see that in the way that, at least 3 different times, you can see this image of them pushing through the crowd and pushing through these obstacles that want to keep them from getting to Jesus. They risked their reputations. I wonder what could have happened to the bleeding woman. I mean, Betsy, when she came to Jesus and said what she had done, that she had touched him, it says that she came with fear and with trembling. Almost like an acknowledgement that she had put herself in the line of fire because what she had done was wrong. But then Jesus, being who he is, he embraced her and he welcomed her and he applauded her faith because she had really gotten it. She had had a belief and a trust in who Jesus was, and she had believed it so much that she was willing to take action. And that's the same faith that we have in common with them too. Faith is trust and belief plus action. Both of their faith involved believing that Jesus was willing and able to heal them. And it involved trust that his ways are higher, that his plans are good. And ultimately, their faith led to connection with Jesus, which is where healing takes place as we are connected to the source of all life. So I just want to encourage us, in conclusion, to really ask ourselves, what are the things or the obstacles that often get in the way of us from seeking Jesus? What are the things that maybe we feel like, oh, it's too late, or oh, it's too far? What are the areas that we feel like God is wanting to bring healing to in our lives? And I know for myself, my prayer, as I read through this and I'm challenged, is I love how they were able to see Jesus and let everything else fall to the background and just see Jesus for who he is and to trust and believe in what he wanted for them. And for myself, that's something that I'm praying for, is to just lose sometimes the muck and the mire that so we can get caught up in with religion, and just cling to Jesus and just have a connection with him and touch him, because when we're in his presence, there is healing. He is the source of all life. Amen.